This program is made possible in part by Nebraskans for Public Television. Consider This, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bales Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome once again to Consider This. We would like you to consider something this week, and that's the state of Nebraska's rural areas. Not just the economics, but the social and support systems. And recently a report has been issued after doing a series of interviews and focus groups that sort of outline some things that we maybe knew but know better. My guest this week is Kathy Bigsby Moore. She is Executive Director for Voices for Children Nebraska in Nebraska. And you do the annual kids count every year, and I think that the cumulative body of knowledge that you've gotten from that has been a real viable set of information for Nebraska lawmakers and individuals. But this is a whole new thing, and it's got a long name.
Right, way too long, of course.
But no, but it says what it is. It's a rural road exploring economic services and social supports that affect rural families. Now, this was a multi-state effort.
Right, this is a project that we entered into with North Dakota and South Dakota Kids Count grantees. The Kids Count report is done in every state in the country. So there are two agencies in North and South Dakota also releasing reports in their state, and our organization, Voices for Children. And we, through meetings that we attend, we kept talking about how different our states were from many other states, most other states in the country, in that we're predominantly rural. We have actually very high poverty rates in our rural communities, and yet overall we rank fairly well for the well-being of Nebraska and North and South Dakota families. And so we wanted to look at why we have this kind of disparity within our state and what is unique to us.
Well, I guess we could have figured there was some disparity, knowing that we've, just sitting watching the window of news pass by us about go through the 80s and the farm crisis and the constant barrage of stories about the young people leaving our state, particularly from greater Nebraska. So, it's not a surprise, but was there anything that surprised you just before we get to, figures, and we're not going to go on those ad nauseum, but just anything that surprised you went out and about?
I think the first thing that surprised me when we just began exploring whether or not North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska were indeed different from the rest of the country is that 18 of the counties of our three states are the poorest of the 50 poorest counties in the country. That is not the picture that most people would have of our three states.
And some of those are in Nebraska.
Yes, exactly. Actually, more are in Nebraska than in North and South Dakota. And we have families that we have worked with in some of those counties, in Cherry County and in the Loop City area, and we know that those families are very proud, do not consider themselves to be poor, and in fact really rebel against the term poorest county in the country. And so we really wanted to probe further and see what those counties are comprised of and what life really is like for those families.
Well, I think that there are some offsetting penalties here. At least that's the feeling I get reading things, is that you may have to do without some things, but there isn't the pressure to have all those things. But when you start to get into things like health care, we're not talking about whether you have an extra car or whether you have more CDs or a newer computer. We're talking about something beyond that.
Exactly. You're right. The offset is that many families were pleased to say that their child did not have to have the latest model of Nikes. They didn't have to have a $100 pair of shoes in order to be accepted in their school. But they may have a 60 to 70 mile drive to the doctor. They may not have a dentist who is within a reasonable amount of time, and if they're on public assistance, they may not have a dentist that accepts Medicaid or Kids Connection services. So the offset, of course, is the simpler lifestyle. And actually, when we had a series of focus groups, and we had wonderful families who came and spent a good part of an evening with us. And those families indicated clearly that they choose small town life because of family connections or connections with friends. They've often lived there for generations. They also choose it because it's a simpler lifestyle and because they believe it's a safer lifestyle. And some people who live in cities say, well, I don't know that, farm equipment is a very safe, it's a different context in which they're viewing safety. But what we do know is that those families work very, very hard day in and day out just to get up in the morning and get their work done and go to bed at night. They work much, much harder than most of us in the urban areas do.
Raw hours.
Absolutely. Many of them are looking at a commute, and that might be a commute to work, it might be a commute to take their child to school, or it might be a commute to the town that has a store, a grocery store,
a real
etc.,
grocery
a real store where they can do a week's shopping. We had one individual who just the day before our meeting had made a 240-mile round trip to get a tractor part. He couldn't bring his crops in until he got his tractor fixed, and so that was a 240-mile trip just to get that part. So it's much longer days than what we are used to putting in. And they probably get much better at multitask functioning, because many of them talked about hour-and-a-half rides where the kids listen to Nebraska Public Radio and do their homework, and they might do spelling lists on the way, etc.
So they make the best of it. But okay, so I'm kind of the kind that says, well, you make your bed, and you got that quality of life you wanted, and you got this, and you have that, and even if you chose that. Well, everyone doesn't exactly choose that. Circumstances might leave them there without options, or they might be middle-aged to older or don't have skills, and at least they own the house they live. I mean, there's all kinds of mitigating factors for probably the majority.
Well,
I mean, it's not like
that's true.
I'm just going to leave the farm
Yeah, that's very true. But I guess one of the things we're hoping this report does is show all Nebraskans how important rural Nebraska is to all of us. Most of us, if we go back 1 or 2 generations, we find that rural is in our heritage. It's the heart of our heritage. Most of us had someone who settled here and opened a store or bought some acres or whatever.
Oh, but that's ancient history, Kathy.
Yeah. Well, but it isn't.
But it seems like.
And if it becomes ancient history, then our state has a whole new set of problems, because agriculture is still the heartbeat of our economy.
And we will still need to use those acres to
Exactly.
farm. Now, the question is, how is that going to be? What
Right.
scenario will that take? Will that be, and I'm not making an anti-corporate farm, but I mean, the extreme would be very large farms, people with no stake in the
Right.
land, and then what are already low wages in a sense, because farmers don't make, in general, a lot of money, could become even lower.
Right.
More migrant workers.
Corporate farms typically don't reinvest in our state and in their communities in the same way that locally owned farmers do. We need, though, to also have a balance of choices of where people in Nebraska can live, because a lot of those people are choosing to live there. Many of them are wanting to leave, ready to leave, can't get it together enough, can't get enough revenues together. But if the revenues were there, they might also choose to stay just because it's the lifestyle they choose. So I think as a native Nebraskan, I've always been very proud that we have the diversity that we do, and I want to preserve that. I think part of the difficulty is that folks who live in Omaha and Lincoln on the east end, the urban area of the state, don't have a true appreciation for the rural side of our state and don't really understand the beauty that it holds, as well as the value that it holds for all of our economy.
The real danger question is that it's a tenuous existence in some parts of the state, not just in terms of income, but in terms of resources. You mentioned doctors, dentists. And the fewer those become, the more people will leave, and then the fewer they will
Exactly.
become. And so you reach critical mass of where you can go from just getting by to really a destitute problem in terms of resources. I'm not saying just
Right.
raw dollars, but being able to handle what could be just an easily fixable illness could be
Right.
life-threatening.
And the challenge is you look at the economy of scale,
That's-
and you are never going to get the economy of scale in Burwell, Nebraska, or Hyannis, or
But they have a
Arthur.
nice rodeo in Burwell.
That's exactly
They have a
right.
very
have
good rodeo.
They have a lot of wonderful things
they
in
do.
all of these areas. That's the sadness that more Nebraskans don't really know what's going on and appreciate it. But that economy of scale, part of the reason that I think Voices for Children is a good vehicle for some change is that we are focusing on children and family issues. Some of the solutions that we're putting forth are public assistance, what look like government helping out programs, but some of them are addressing the economy of scale. That while each of those towns may not be able to support its own grocery store buying its own commodities one by one, we are beginning to see some of those grocery stores go together in a cooperative relationship so that if they have buying power that actually is 6 grocery stores, they have a larger buying power, they can get lower prices, and they can work together cooperatively. There are many incentives that can be put in place that are tax-based and economic-based that aren't really government providing assistance, public assistance, but government facilitating an economy of scale that's more appropriate to rural Nebraska.
There's a lot of talk right now about LB 775, the corporate incentives bill that was passed some time ago, and whether it was really creating more jobs. I mean, you can go on and on about that, but as a taxpayer, I've never minded corporate incentives or breaks if they provide real value to the community.
Right.
So that it's like you can kind of get a rebate if this happens. In other words, we're not just giving away money. And so that you sort of win because the corporation theoretically will earn money, and yet they will be paying out money to more employees or more services or whatever.
Right.
It was a part of a wave of creative thinking in this country to entice corporations. So there's more creative thinking to be done.
Exactly. And I think, again, it's easier when we put 775 in place, and as you said, we could debate probably for several Sundays how effective that has been. But the question is, we as a state, I think we're able to look at a couple of corporations that we were afraid we would lose, and we were able to say, okay, we're willing to invest this tax incentive in keeping our large corporations. But it's harder for us to say, well, we want to keep the Johnson Ranch and the Henson Farm, and we just have not quite figured out exactly what value all of these rural businesses and agricultural businesses bring back to each of us.
There isn't a governor in my recent memory that wasn't concerned about this, and I think Governor Johans is concerned about this. He comes from a rural background. He's a 4-H'er in Iowa,
Right,
and the value of even things like the ability to have 4-H and just those kinds of things. No governor, I think, in their right mind or with any kind of modicum of emotion would not worry about that. But you talked about creative solutions. You still have to have a collective will of the state, and that's urban senators. And we've always heard about this, play ball, kind of thing. Do you have any feel for how that's going, and how not if they're fighting,
Right.
but how the creative process is sort of laws are one thing, but they really involve creativity.
And I'm probably not the best spokesperson to talk historically because Voices has not done agricultural or economic work. I believe that senators are all looking at children and family issues much more carefully than they have in the last 10 to 20 years. And so again, my hope is that if we if we capture this in the light of our children and our families. I'm beginning to see more and more legislators come around the issue than we have in the past. I think actually part of what needs to happen is there needs to be more communication among some of the organizations that have been doing agricultural advocacy for a number of years, because how many of us can intelligently address commodity prices and some of the issues that are also important aspects to be considered. So I think one of the deficits is that perhaps an urban senator doesn't have the same knowledge base that a rural senator does. And I think we've got to create more forums for common discussion between the two entities.
And perhaps there are things that seem miles away in terms of meeting those immediate kinds of needs that really meet many needs. Looking for instance, high-speed data service.
Right.
That can not only lure more business, but it can make people more in touch. They can organize themselves and unite better. It's less expensive in some ways. But Congressman Osborne has been very concerned. But those are the kinds of things that we may overlook in terms of, we know it might bring business, but it can also bring other advantages, communicating with a doctor when you are, being able to, I guess you don't stick your tongue out in front of a television camera, but something.
Actually, in central Nebraska, there is a large mental health collaborative going on, and they are doing teleconferencing, video teleconferencing, mental health therapy sessions. And a lot of people at first were skeptical, saying, oh, how could this possibly be the same? But they've evaluated it very carefully, and the clients are saying, yes, it does work.
Well, if both sides are willing, it's got to be better than nothing.
Exactly. And interestingly enough, there is one piece of legislation, I have not studied it extensively, it just came to my attention recently, that addresses telecommuting, and it provides some incentives for businesses in metropolitan areas to add positions, to add employees who live in rural areas and can telecommute to the larger city. So those are the kinds of, it's like the 775 incentive, but it's addressing
work
rural
that
issues.
Can be, excuse the pun, farmed out.
Exactly.
To people. There was, I think, the World Herald story that covered when your report was released last week, mentioned a woman who does medical transcriptions, types them in her home near Walt Hill, but they're from Denver, doctors in Denver.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are all kinds of opportunities, and tax incentives would be certainly something to consider. You mentioned that there was stigma and prejudice.
Yes.
And we tend to, in urban areas, if you said stigma and prejudice, we have racial pictures. Even now, it's not just racial, perhaps religious-based, is Islam. There's certainly anti-Semitism. But I don't think of it in terms of anything having to do with how we think about people in rural areas or what problems they feel.
And that is clear. Actually, some work that Voices did about 10 years ago was where we first began to get the stigma picture. Public assistance programs that everybody hears about, food stamps, Medicaid, ADC, etc. When we look at the percent of the population that's eligible, income eligible for those services, and then the percent of the population eligible that's using those services, many, many more people in metropolitan areas, percentage-wise, are using those than in rural areas. We might find as low as 20 to 30% of the eligible people in a very rural setting were using it. And it's because of the stigma. It's because when you walk in this certain door, everybody in town knows you're walking through that door to apply for food stamps or whatever it is you're seeking.
If you had the food stamps appear magically at your doorstep, you would have to use them.
Exactly. And then the person behind you, we actually had a story a few years ago where a person behind a woman very loudly criticized the fact that she was buying steak, and gee, he wished he could have steak. Well, it was round steak, and she went up to him and explained that that piece of round steak was actually going to provide 4 meals for her family, and it was a much more economic purchase than a pound of hamburger that would only provide one meal. So there's stigma all around. I think in rural Nebraska also, we have people that are very isolated. We use the word connectedness, and again, we tried to look at social issues, economic, and by social issues we don't mean going to a dance on the weekend. We just mean how are people connected to
Social
each other?
construct.
What kind of supports do they have exactly? And then we looked at services and what is available. And one of the issues for people clearly was this isolation factor. So if you live 35 miles out of town and perhaps you are a tenant ranch manager or a tenant hand on a ranch, you don't have very many folks that you can go to informally for help. If your truck breaks down, you're 35 miles from that help. And so it's really people having to ask for a lot more help than we would in metropolitan areas, and then having it be that much more difficult for them. We also, though, heard so many rich stories, and I don't want to leave people with the impression, I'm speaking as Kathy Moore, Director of Voices for Children. Most of the folks we talk to really love where they live. Yes, they have all of these problems, and yes, they would be delighted to have more of the state investing in their community, but they are not the ones who brought the concerns to us. We went and looked for those concerns.
But there's a chicken and an egg kind of deal here. There is, and this is part of stigma and perception and a prejudice in terms of prejudging that, you know, a certain number of these people want to be self-sufficient, and they're a rather stoic group out there, and I think that there's truth to that many times, and that they aren't going to ask for help. Now, certain percentage won't, but there is, to me, a certain pride, feeling of pride for them that you know that they're proud people, and that's cool. That's really neat to be able to have that. We don't have enough people, in some respects, that feel that way. But on the other hand, that pride may prevent the questioning and this creative process of coming up with new ways, new ideas to get the state or the county or whatever to not even necessarily give money, but to rework the system.
Or utilize what's already there. What we found, you're absolutely right, what we found was that as we'd sit down and we'd have a group of 10 to 15 adults in a focus group just talking about these issues. And so we'd ask them, for instance, about child care. How much child care do you have available? And they'd look around and they'd name Mrs. Smith down the street or somebody who did it last year but they're not able to do it anymore. And then they would start talking about the child care regulations, how cumbersome they were. And then we'd find that the information they were giving us wasn't accurate, that some worker had come in sometime and told someone that these regulations were too difficult. They didn't have anybody in their town that they could bounce that off of. So often they were taking mythical information as fact and never taking the next step to see
We call it
whether
urban
there was
folklore here.
Exactly,
It's rural
folklore. And so sometimes what they need is just one entrepreneurial person who can help them cut through red tape, who can get for them the accurate regulations, and then who can help interpret that. Because if you just don't have somebody around you who's done child care, some of these regulations on paper are very cumbersome and very difficult.
Just with raw numbers in a city, even the size of, let's say, Norfolk or Columbus, which are good-sized cities, but I mean they're not Omaha or Lincoln, the odds are that you know someone that knows something.
Right.
And that it's not a huge chunk of your life to invest to kind of go on this personal quest with that you're not used to doing, that takes time away from something else. And if you get an answer you don't like, you say, well, but I know somebody else. Or and so even if you were just dealing with folklore, you have a better odds of coming up with the right information.
Right. And there's so many, again, in Arthur, Nebraska, the grocery store closed down 5 years ago, and everybody in town kind of said, well, I guess we don't have a grocery store anymore. Well, there was a woman who was a relative newcomer to Arthur, and she didn't want to accept that. And she understood that the grocer hadn't been able to make it, but she also knew that there were some co-ops. and that they had different access to different prices and different products and stuff. And she worked with high school students and actually opened a cooperative grocery store in Arthur, Nebraska about 2.5 years ago. And it's thriving. It's doing wonderfully. It's giving students a service learning project. And we just found example after example. But in our state, there isn't always even a good way to share those examples from one small town to the next.
You know what would be really cool if all these states that are doing this, or doing it in clusters of states, couldn't put this rural experience
Right.
together just in a bullet form, or things that sources, and then I'm sure ultimately as you progress in this project you'll find ways to help streamline information.
Well, and to just get the word out, we're really hoping that our report, which is not full of a lot of numbers and graphs, it's full of
and
stories.
it's probably one of the most readable reports. Lovely pie charts, beautiful pictures. You can go to the Voices for Children website,
Right.
and download it if you have Adobe Acrobat, which you can get for nothing
Exactly.
on the internet. And so your local library or whatever librarian can help you download it.
And we really hope more people will do that, because we tried to make it very appealing looking and very informative, telling lots of stories. I also just learned that a class in Loop City, Nebraska is developing, or has developed, a website, because they're in one of the counties that was identified as one of the poorest in the nation, and it frustrated the kids. The kids did not want to be known as a poor county. So as I understand it, they're putting together a website that's going to talk about the beauty of their county and all of the richness. So I think there probably are more places like that that folks can go to begin to get a true sense of what our state really looks like, and how we all can work together to maintain this heartland that we all value.
Well, we have less than a minute left. To your city brothers and sisters, besides the beauty and just the experience of rural, why should we care?
Because it's important to all of us. If we want our own businesses and our own families to be healthy and vibrant, we have to maintain the vibrancy of our heartland, our plains, our bluffs.
And we do have some nice plains and bluffs, and people should get out more. Maybe we need all these communities to have a contest, and chambers of commerce and tourism to get families out there.
Right.
I know that sounds like, oh, let's have a party and it's so wonderful, but I mean, there needs to be something to spur people to
I would
travel on.
make a pitch for people the next time they have to go west. Take another route. Don't just take I-80. We have Indian reservations that everybody in Nebraska should visit. You can go up through Broken Bow. You can go from
Incredible
North Platte
changes
to Valentine.
in scenery. It's
Exactly.
very nice. I want to thank you for being with us.
you.
It's a rural road exploring economic opportunities, social networks, services, and supports that affect rural families. Find it on the Voices for Children Nebraska website. Just do a search. And remember to join us at UN Omaha, UNOTV at unomaha.edu. Too many letters. Have a good one. See you next week.
This program is made possible in part by Nebraskans for Public Television.